I want to welcome you back to Theology Curator. This is Kurt Willems, and I'm excited about today's episode. It's rooted in a conversation I had with J.R. Briggs. He wrote a book called The Sacred Overlap, and it's an excellent book, and the conversation is one of the most, I just really loved it. It was one of my favorites that I've had in a long time. In fact, one of the things I realized as I was going back through my catalog of interviews was that his interview accidentally got skipped in the release process. So he and I had this conversation about probably 3 or 4 months ago. It was in the fall, and I really feel bad about that. But I don't want you to think that it was because I was skipping him until I had nothing else to do. I've got tons of great episodes coming up. But JR, I just love what he brings to the table. I love his perspective on being the church and embodying the kingdom. So you, my friends, are in for a real treat with this conversation. A couple other things I'll mention. The first is this week, my video is going to be releasing. My trailer for the book is coming out, and I'm pretty excited about that. It's a really cool trailer. I say words, but it was really my friend Riley Endicott who edited and had the creative vision for it. So I hope you'll check that out, and also check out Riley Endicott on YouTube, because he's really the creative force behind this thing. Lastly, I wanted to say, of course, since I'm talking about a book trailer, of course, there's a book coming out in March. And so I hope you'll consider pre-ordering that. You can do so at echoinghope.com. That's echoinghope.com. And you can also find a sample of the book and other things like a list of endorsers, and just get a feel for what the book's about. So check it out. And with that said, let's finally get to my friend, J.R. Briggs.
Welcome to Theology Curator, a podcast hosted by Kurt Willems and available online at theologycurator.com. Each episode looks at a theological, formational, or cultural theme. We might dig into the life and letters of a radical Jewish teacher named Paul, converse about a pressing contemporary issue, reflect on the nature of following Jesus today, or even attempt to remedy doom and gloom preaching with a good old-fashioned dose of hope. This show is an invitation to build bridges between the first century world of the earliest Christ followers into the 21st century reality we now inhabit. The Jesus we excavate from the rubble of tradition might just surprise us all.
Hey, I want to welcome you back to the podcast. This is Kurt Willems, and I am sitting across the interwebs from my friend J.R. Briggs, who has written a new book called The Sacred Overlap, Learning to Live Faithfully in the Space in Between. J.R., great
Thanks for having me on, Kurt. Man. Really appreciate it.
Oh, yeah. No, it's my pleasure. And, I think based on kind of your work and what you've done in ministry in general, and then what you're doing with this book, I think a lot of people who listen to this podcast are going to be excited to step in and hear some of your thoughts today. So maybe we can start with your background. Some people may not know your story, and I'd love to hear sort of how, and I can make this so general that it feels like it's a question to fill the whole podcast, of course, right? But really, if you can give us some of the grounding, some of the nuggets of your story when it comes to how did you step into ministry, and how did that transition into some of the work you're doing now, including writing books?
Well, I grew up in Puerto Rico the first few years of my life, and then most of my upbringing was in Charlottesville, Virginia. But I have this weird story, Kurt, that I actually knew that I'd be going into ministry when I was in 6th grade. And it wasn't this hallelujah chorus, spotlight from heaven. It was just realizing that I had such an impact on people who were older, and their faith was so mature, and I was so moldable in that time, and I found their faith to be attractive. And I said, that's not only the most important thing, but that's the kind of life that I want to live and help others do. And I looked around and I said, well, I think that's ministry. And so I knew, since 6th grade, and that I had some sort of ministry in my background. I went to Taylor University, was going to play basketball at Taylor, but got there and fell in love with the campus and the culture and the community there that I found myself saying, I'm not sure I want to live on a gym floor for 4 years of my life in college. So I went on a recruiting visit, but I just said, hey, I think I'm just going to be a student here. And I'm so grateful, had a great experience. But out of that, I kind of mourned that because my only exposure to ministry were like suit and tie, hymnals, organs, pews. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I thought, this isn't who I am. Yeah. And so how do I be myself, but also be faithful to the gospel story? And then we started attending shortly after we were married in a church called Pierced Chapel in Colorado. And when we were first married, and I just would cry every time because I thought, wow, they're using the arts. They're using all sorts of creativity here. They're thinking outside the box about who Jesus is and communicating that well. And I had never seen anything like it before. And so I said, Lord, I want to do something like this. And a few years later, the South African couple that was leading it was called back to South Africa to plant a church. And we would just lay awake at night and say, Lord, if we could ever do something like Pierced, sign us up. We'd love to do that. And that South African couple approached us and said, hey, we've been praying and wondering if you all would replace us and you would pastor this congregation. And so did that and loved it. And then went to, and I'm a teacher. I know I'm a teacher, wired as a teacher. Doesn't mean I'm great at it, but it means that I get life and enjoyment from that. And I think there's a charism, a gift God's given me in that. And for me, writing is teaching on paper. And so I just began writing as a way of articulating how am I working out this idea of faith. And I love studying. I'm kind of a nerd in that. And so just trying to match life with sort of this beautiful stream of the Christian faith that we have, while also trying to bring the cookies to the bottom shelf, not to dumb it down, but to make the gospel story accessible to people. So that kind of teaching and then teaching on paper through writing kind of coalesced together to this confluence of just kind of who I am and how God's wired me.
That's awesome, man. I mean, it makes so much sense. And actually, I think I resonate with you in that writing for me really comes out of, sure, there's some creativity and I'm sure you experience the creative side of it. But really, at the end of the day, that teaching gift, that teaching passion, and I know with my own book that I've been writing, I had my editor who was awesome, but have to say, hey, teacher, make sure you're also pastor, and so, which makes for a better book. It was actually what I needed to hear that feedback, but I thoroughly get that. And so you clearly have been doing ministry, and now you do quite a few different things, writing being one of them, but you're also talk to us about Kairos partnerships and some of the other work you're doing in coaching and forming leaders.
Yeah, well, I've had the privilege of working with house churches, church plants. I've been on staff of mega churches, and so I feel like I've gotten a good broad bandwidth of God's people here in North America and how God's people gather together. And so I'm grateful for that. I planted a church here in the Philadelphia area back in 2008 and was really grateful for that opportunity. But a few years ago, there were opportunities to serve. I was asked to come on part-time with a church planting network called the Ecclesia Network. Other church planters began to say, will you coach me? I began to be invited to teach and speak at some more places. And so through some wise counsel of those that love me and care for me and are just very wise souls in my life, they said, you know what would it look like if you, instead of pastored a local congregation, might it be that the Lord's calling you to pastor pastors, shepherd shepherds, and lead leaders? And at first I thought they were crazy, but the Lord just kept opening door after door of opportunities that I then went part-time, and a guy that we had mentored and grown and discipled, he came on full-time to pastor kind of the day-to-day activities while I did sort of the vision and the big picture and the teaching side of things at the church, until it got to the point of then having an opportunity to pursue a doctorate. And I just knew I couldn't do everything. And so I went to our elders and said, I love this congregation. I think it's time for me to pass this off. And with tears in their eyes, but with smiles on their faces, they said, we agree with you. We think this is the right time. So it was a beautiful transition. We're so grateful for that. Ironically, my wife and I and our family, we still worship there. The elders have said, we really want you to stay. And I said, actually, the people that I coach say you're not supposed to do that. I say, this is not a good thing. You don't want to be in the way. And they said, we know, but we really believe that God's doing something great and that you are healthily paranoid about being in the way. And because of that, we really think this can work. So so we worship at the church that I planted, and the church is doing great. The leadership is doing great. Even through COVID, they're just leading really well. I'm so proud of our elders and our pastors. They pastor me. And that frees me up then to, through coaching, I do consulting, speaking, writing. I teach as a affiliate faculty member of practical theology at Missio Seminary, a small seminary here in the Philadelphia area. So I tell people I basically moved from the emergency room to now I'm working at a teaching hospital, teaching doctors how to be better doctors or how to become doctors. And so I'm still in the quote unquote spiritual medical profession, but I just get a chance to maybe do it in a different way that's not in an ER itself. So so I love it. And it's been a win for me. It's been a win for our church. I think it's been a win for the leaders at our church. And I'm really grateful to be able to do this. And there have been a lot of leaders hurting through COVID. And so this has been a very full and intense time for them as well as for me. And pastors are lonely. Pastors are in a place where it's just so intense, and my heart breaks, and I'm actually a bit concerned where this trajectory is going with the livelihood and flourishing of pastors here in the next several months. No, being one of those pastors, I mean, I empathize with that concern, and I hear about it, I see it, I've had to process my own stuff, and so I totally get that, and it's really cool to hear about the good work you're doing, and also just how the Lord has just kind of guided that path, and you always, or I should say, I always love hearing stories about, a transition from a church leadership position, and transitioning out of that and it being this like beautiful, holy relationship maintaining sort of thing. It doesn't always work. It's not always possible, but I've heard a few stories like yours, and I just think it's a beautiful thing. And, in addition to that, you just finished your doctorate. Yes.
Am I remembering this right? Like, you just defended the thing recently, right? Tell us about some of that really quick. What did you focus on, and where did you go? And all of those things.
I actually went to Missio Seminary where I now teach, and it was a fantastic experience. And I think as a white male, it was very important for me to be in a program where I was a significant minority. I was only one of 2 white males in the entire program, and that was really important for me. I had great professors, but it was really important for me to be surrounded by African American and Asian brothers and sisters. I was just one of 2 white males, and that was really, really formative for me during that time. In addition to that, my dissertation topic, which is an absolute passion of mine, and I give credit to my doctoral advisor, Dr. Derek Cooper. He said, if you're going to do this program, you're only allowed to write on one thing. And I said, what? Like, my eyes got huge. I was kind of scared to hear his answer. And he said, you are so passionate about the idea of questions and question asking. And he said, I know that you long to write on this and actually teach and train leaders how to ask better questions for greater kingdom fruit. So I want you to really press in and focus on this area called meutics, which is the study of questions. And there's been studies on meutics that have been more in the secular realm, but of saying, I want you to study Jesus's questions, and I want you to see what can we learn from that so that we can be better communicators of the gospel message with a posture of question asking rather than answer giving. And I remember just blurting out, just starting to cry in his office. I'm like, I can't think of anything else I'd want to write on. I'm so grateful you want to encourage me in this direction. So, I loved it. It was great. I mean, I wouldn't say I loved the whole process of writing a dissertation, but I loved my topic and was so grateful to do that. And I finished writing this this other book at the same time. So life was certainly busy the last year and a half, but really grateful for the experience, and learned a ton and have many opportunities to teach leaders how to ask better questions for the sake of kingdom fruit, which has been such a blast.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. I mean, that should be a topic of a podcast someday, because I think that's being able to ask good questions. Because I don't know if this resonates, but I, as a pastor, have just observed, and not necessarily always from my congregation, but just sort of a general thing that I'm noticing for pastors is, of course, every question is a good question, in the sense that we want people to feel free to ask questions. But sometimes I think some pastors in some contexts are getting some really like surface level questions that have very, what am I trying to say? There's like agendas tied to questions, and helping people get past those agenda spaces and to what's beneath that, to ask the harder questions, the ones that maybe invite self-reflection and challenge us a little bit. And as leaders, we need to be asking those questions of ourselves, of course. And so, yeah, I'd someday love to just talk about questions. And what you've discovered.
There's so much there. I mean, one of the things I developed in the dissertation was there are 4 levels of all questions. And so first of all, it's just being aware of what they are, and then what level questions that I normally default to, and then how can I go deeper to the next level of questions. And if you just go through that lens and look at Jesus's questions, each of the 4 levels are there. You know, Jesus asked over 300 questions. He's asked over 183. What's interesting is he only answers 5 of them directly in all of the Gospels. So
wow.
Anyway, I could keep going. I should stop, but I just there's so much there with the questions of Jesus and what we can learn. And it was Peter Drucker, who I don't believe had any faith background, but the late Peter Drucker, the leadership guru, he said, the leaders of the past were the ones that were able to give all the right answers, but the leaders of the future will be the ones that ask the right questions. And I absolutely believe that to be true.
Wow. That's powerful. Yeah. And I'm right there with you. Definitely agree with that. And I hear maybe another book.
It's in the works.
But that's for you to decide, of course. Okay. Good. So we do have an excellent topic though today, the sacred overlap. And we're talking about learning to live faithfully in the space between. And this just you're speaking a language. I mean, this language of liminality, this language of it's not either or and us versus them. I just really love that. And I'm glad you've taken a book to unpack that. What inspired the book? Like, where did you get the idea for this book, and how did the process of creating it, how did that develop?
There are 2 answers to that. One is more personal and the other is more logistical. I was asked in 2016 to speak at a breakout session at the Fresh Expressions National Gathering on how do we help people move from just hanging out to then exploring Jesus. And I just found myself in my note development time, my preparation, of realizing, wow, there's a whole lot of kind of both and stuff here, and started digging into Jesus and how did he go from hanging out to then having people explore who he was on a deeper level. And I just began to say, wow, there's a lot of overlap here, and then started to dig into the scriptures and realize more and more, wow, there's a lot here. The second thing, on a personal level, I'm a visual learner. And so my friends always chuckle because every time I pull out there's a whiteboard, or I pull out a notebook or a napkin, I'm always drawing Venn diagrams. I'm obsessed with Venn diagrams, even to the point that I've got like a Venn diagram like tattooed on my right arm. And I just I love Venns so much. And I thought that's a perfect metaphor for where Jesus actually lives. There's all these worlds that he straddles. And then if he's there, then we need, if we're taking Jesus seriously, to join him in that overlapping space of that Venn diagram. So I just started just nerding out on I'm going to learn everything I can about Venn diagrams, and just read biographies of John Venn, the popularizer of the Venn diagram, and started to learn all sorts of things like that football shape we see on 2 overlapping circles of a Venn diagram has a name, which I didn't even know, called a mandorla, the Italian word for almond. And I realized, Jesus is in the mandorla. And then you look at church art, and you look at frescoes and you look at stained glass windows and all sorts of ancient iconography, all this stuff, Jesus is actually painted and depicted in the middle of mandalas. And I said, wait a second, what's this about? And artists for centuries have realized that Jesus being fully God and fully man, bringing heaven to earth, they thought the best way to represent that was to paint Jesus in mandalas. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's everywhere in Christian art. And I began to go, whoa, there's something here. So I kept peeling back more and more layers and realized that Jesus lives there. But the problem is that I grew up in a tradition, as many, I think, evangelicals did today over the last few decades, where they've been told Jesus is either or, right? Like, and he is the great either or. But what's fascinating when you read the scriptures, as soon as we choose life over death, we choose Jesus over the rest of the world. And there is some binary world that we live in, right? Light and darkness, as John talks about, and life and death, and choose this day whom you will serve, Joshua talks about. But once we follow Jesus, man, there's a whole bunch of things that make the either or paradigm very uncomfortable for us because Jesus lives in so many both ands or and alsos. And so that's the sacred overlap. That's kind of, this is a long answer to your short question, but my love for Venn diagrams, digging into the scripture, and then having to articulate this in 2016 at this national gathering really helped me press in and say, there's something here. And I looked around and I didn't find many people talking about it. And I said, maybe it's time to put some of this nuanced understanding down on the paper.
Yeah, that's awesome. And Venn diagrams, by the way, I love them too. I think it's a great image, and I hope we can explore that a little bit. But in a practical note, Venn diagrams have made their way back into the interwebs lately, right? Like on Facebook and Twitter, and they're memes, and they're sometimes. So here's my question for you: Venn diagrams can be excessively helpful because it talks about the tension you're describing, which I fully affirm. And then sometimes you get these that are so like complicated, but also so, what's the word I'm looking for? They're kind of driven by maybe some sort, it feels agenda-ish almost, like during the COVID thing. It's okay to believe this is happening and that is happening, or racism. It's okay to believe that what happened to George Floyd is bad, but that police officers are good, and this, and we're this thing in between. So talk to us about the danger or the maybe misuse. And I don't want to put words in your mouth about whether you agree or disagree with my sort of example per se, as much to say, can these Venn diagrams be unhelpful? And what does that look like before we start talking about how they're helpful? Yeah,
it's a great question. And I always go back to this, whatever metaphor, illustration, visual diagram, whatever I use, I always remind people they always break down, right? Symbols, metaphors, illustrations, they always break down at some point. And
Absolutely.
So, I mean, in anything, it can be agenda driven and therefore manipulative, and we want to be careful of that. And so, I mean, whatever it may be, whatever the example may be, I think we always need to ask, what's the motive behind wanting to generate that? And so, and I tell people, look, if you're a visual learner like me and it's helpful, awesome. If it's not, then no problem. I think where it is helpful, at least in what I was trying to write, is for those of us who live in the West, where mystery and paradox are often seen as a curse or something to be explained away, Venn diagrams can be very helpful. Now, our Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters have done a fantastic job for centuries talking about how we can hold two things in tension, not as in conflict fighting tension, but healthy rubber band pulling tension. And it was my best way to describe an Eastern idea of mystery and paradox in the most Western way possible of a Venn diagram.
Yes, 100% yes. That's awesome. And it feels, so I'm looking at the cover of your book right now, which I have book cover jealousy. I just love it. I love this cover. So it's minimalistic, but artistic. And those who can't see the cover right now, there's these artistic sort of watercolor Venn diagrams that have two different colors coming together in the middle. And to me, when I see that in more of an artful way, it draws me into the more of the Eastern thing, more of the mystery of what's in between there, more of the, and I think a lot of people, as we know, from the last 20 years of transition that church in the West has been in a lot of ways, there is a large population of people who desire more mystery, more ambiguity, and nuance and clarity, but also mystery. They want to step into something that's not so boxed up. And I love that you're proposing that and giving language to that. And, one of the issues that I think of when I see this image, and I know is something you care about a lot. I'm going to use big words and then we'll break it down to small words, but cosmological dualism, right? This idea that heaven and earth are these sort of utterly separate things that really don't interact much. Heaven is up there somewhere, and that's really the good thing, and the bad thing is this thing. That's one image that comes to mind immediately. And it seems that the gospel is about, no, there's heaven and earth and they belong together, and we can follow Jesus in that space. And so I'm curious about that particular idea. How does this idea of the dualism of even how we consider the Christian hope start to really play into the importance of seeing?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up, because if we're Christians that take Jesus's words seriously, and many of us, even those who don't have a faith background, are at least familiar with, if not, they can recite the Lord's Prayer. We pray that and sort of bust up this idea of dualism right away. When we say, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. If we are constantly saying, the goal isn't to take earth to heaven as we die, it's to bring heaven to earth as we live. That's just not a fun little bumper sticker statement. That totally changes what it means to be a Christian moving forward. And there are so many Christians that say, well, I'm just going to wait it out. And, one day this will all burn, and, I'm just going to go to heaven one day. But I think Jesus is going, no, I'm asking you to bring heaven down to earth right now, today, as you live. That's what you pray in the Lord's Prayer. Do you get it? And I think one of the things I love that I mentioned in the book is Dallas Willard. Riley used to say, if that's God's purpose for your life, that you just become a Christian and then, wait it out until you die. He says, go now. What are you waiting for? Just go to heaven now. And he's trying to elicit a chuckle, but to say, if that's all we're supposed to do, what are we doing here from conversion until death? And that there's a greater purpose here. And we become overlapped people, mandorla people, when we actually believe and live out what we actually pray in the Lord's Prayer. And that Lord's Prayer, we know it, but I'm not sure we really know how much spiritual TNT that we're playing with when we pray that prayer. In addition, it's actually a prayer for the past, the present, and also the future, right? Forgive us our sins, past, give us our daily bread, and for your glory forever and ever in the future. So we actually are praying mandorla prayers even as we do it for our temporal needs, eating, and our eternal needs. Forgive us. And so there's this, we just have to realize the overlapping prayer that we're praying, past, present, and future, temporal and eternal. And those are real things. It's this yearning for overlapping worlds. And so, again, the mystery of the Eastern Orthodox faith. I'm not Eastern Orthodox, but I'm so grateful for our brothers and sisters who are willing to help us with that. In some ways, it's kind of like closing one eye. I mean, you can still see out of one eye, but your depth perception and your peripheral vision is skewed significantly. And we actually need both eyes to be able to see with sharpness and clarity and depth, kind of like a baseball outfielder trying to catch a pop fly. It's possible. It's nearly impossible. It can be done, but it's so much better when you've got two eyes trying to catch a pop fly in the outfield. And I think Jesus is inviting us to actually live life with both eyes open. And if we only have one eye open and the other closed, then we're living in a dualism that is actually stunting our growth, and it is anemic to our understanding of what it means to be kingdom people.
Wow, that's so good on so many levels. I mean, yes. Oh, I love that. Thank you. And I think the Lord's Prayer is the obvious place that we forget to start, and when that was unlocked for me, in the early 2000s, when I finally started saying, oh wait, there's more to this story here. There's creation is longing for its liberation, and there's space. We live in this already not yet space. Massive implications for how I understood my own witness as a Christian, discipleship, the purpose of the church, and all of that stuff that I know you definitely step into in a lot of ways. And, it's really, really fascinating to me as you talk about the Eastern Orthodox specifically. As a tangent, I've often wondered, what would our expressions of church be like if we replaced Rome with the East, Constantinople or whatever, right? Like if experientially faith would have been what the Eastern church has always handed down, but seated in Rome. I wonder what kinds of things we would be deconstructing. They'd be, radically different. But yeah, I think you're getting at something that we have in a gift from the Eastern church. And I love it. And I'm curious now. So I want to get down to some real life stuff. Discipleship and the church's witness, right? Talk about some of the damage, first of all, that you're seeing, that we really struggle with either or. Like we're missing that mandorla space when it comes to witness and discipleship. And talk about some of the struggles you've observed and some of the invitations and hope and anything else you might want to sort of
it's a great question. I think we're seeing this here, especially as we're careening toward a presidential election here in a little bit this fall. And we just live in a world that's just so incredibly divisive, and the polarization is just becoming so intense and sharp. And so those cultural and political, the religious, relational, the racial divides, as they become more and more intense and those arguments become more explosive, instead of speaking out against it, unfortunately, the church here in the West has actually joined in on the divisiveness in a way that's been really damaging to the witness of Christ. And so those widening differences are leaving us with this ever intensifying us versus them tribalism. And that's where I began to think there's got to be a better way than this. So what is the posture then of a follower of Jesus when things are so divisive and the culture has told us you've got to either be in box A or box B, and the church has said, okay, well, let's choose one. And I really believe that we've got to think bigger than that. And if we just fall into those, we fall into empire mindset instead of kingdom mindset. And so this is where it becomes really difficult because, most people who have no faith background in the U.S. or a previous faith background look at evangelicals and think of one box that people have chosen to be in. And one of the things that I love is that I heard someone share when I was in college, and I never forgot it. He said, when we're faithfully following Jesus, we will be too Christian for our pagan friends and too pagan for our Christian friends. And that we are almost uncategorizable. Wow. And so we've got to learn to discern where we follow God when he says yes and follow God when he says no. And our calling is really to determine where his yes is and where his no is and to obey that. I know that sounds a little bit ethereal, but it's really important as we think through things like discipleship. I mean, one of the concepts we see the early church wrestled with was this idea of resident aliens, which in and of itself is a Venn diagram and an overlapping mandorla. I live here. I'm not a citizen here. This is my zip code, but this is not my identity. And so how do we be the kinds of people who understand I shouldn't have a place here? I shouldn't fit in without even thinking. And, the problem is that, politically speaking, even as we, again, are heading toward the election here, we should never look to our candidates as saviors or models of morality. I mean, politicians are vehicles of potential change, but they're not our rescuers. Sure, they can help, but they cannot ultimately fix the sin-marred world that we live in. So we cannot accept a politician or a particular party into our heart as Lord and Savior. And that's really important.
Right.
And Michael Ware of the AND campaign He said something a few years ago that really rocked me. He said, the crisis for Christians is not that we're politically homeless. The crisis is that we ever thought we could make a home in politics at all. And he said, if we find ourselves in Babylon, let's make sure we don't become Babylonians. And that has always stuck with me. And so as a Christian, we pledge allegiance first, not to a political party or to a politician, but to a king led by who's leading a kingdom. And because of this, we don't need to be afraid. And I think that's the biggest concern I have, is that we don't have to be afraid. It's one of the most repeated commands in all of Scripture. Don't be afraid. We live in a culture that preys on people's fears, and the political machine is designed to thrive on making people angry, scared, or both. And when we're fearful and we feel unsafe, we become unkind and we become tribalistic in how we think, which then destroys our witness and leaves us with a skewed and anemic and perverted understanding of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus.
Yeah, you're nailing it. And that's fear and anger have been very clear through the pandemic. I mean, that's the two, I think, big, real cultural emotions that come up so often in these discussions. People are afraid, people are angry, and some of this is justifiable. I mean, you know, if you're a person of color trying to navigate life in a situation that is less safe for you because of your skin, your identity, and your context, well, of course, fear and anger, like we're going to have these emotions, but it does seem as though they've been ramped up, even beyond, you know, some of the what I would consider the justifiable sort of obvious areas like that. And I'm curious about, you know, when we think about spiritual formation, how do we form disciples into this sort of the in-between space, that sacred overlap? How do we actually help folks and maybe in our own lives, right? So not just thinking about, not everyone listening to this is going to be a church leader per se. So even in their own journey, maybe they're just saying, I want to lean into the sacred overlap. This sounds awesome, but how does it help me be a better parent? How does it help me be, you know, just in my daily life? And what does it look like? What are some sort of signposts that you might sort of
it's a great question.
Towards?
And Kurt, I'm just so grateful for the questions you're asking. They're very thoughtful and incisive and get to the heart of the issue. I think immediately I think of something that Tony Evans said. He said, Jesus didn't come to take sides. He came to take over. And that sounds kind of like a nice little pithy quip, but there's so much truth to that. And I think if we can learn as followers of Jesus our identity. I think so much of identity politics has taken over, even among Christians in North America. But if we can realize that Jesus didn't come to take sides, he came to take over, and therefore, what does it mean for me to submit wholeheartedly every area of my life to his? That's an identity thing. And I'm a big Dallas Willard fan, so I have so many, Dallas Willard quips and wise thoughts running through my head.
Oh, I love it. Me too.
And so that idea, I think it's important living in the sacred overlap that we've got to make sure that when we disagree with people, and we will, that we don't disengage, because our culture is trying to help us and convince us, persuade us of two huge lies. The first one is, if you disagree with someone's lifestyle, you must fear or hate them. And the second lie is that if you love someone, it means you have to agree with everything that they believe or do. And we don't have to compromise conviction in order to be compassionate to people. And I think Christians fall into these two lies all the time. And the other thing I would encourage people to do, which is what we've been encouraging those who are wanting to grow in their discipleship to be followers of Jesus and take that seriously, is to say, look at all of the overlaps that Jesus found himself in. And so Jesus, I didn't make this up. I mean, the more I study the scriptures, especially the Gospels, the more I see Jesus in this sacred overlap, right? He's fully God and fully man. He's committed to justice and also mercy. He interacts with the woman at the well in John 4, and he says we're to worship in spirit and in truth. The kingdom, is here, but it's also near. He said that the kingdom of God was full of old treasures as well as new. right? And so he calls us to join him in all of these spaces. And then he says things like, be as innocent as doves and also as shrewd as serpents, right? The cross was about failure in his death, but also ultimate victory in his resurrection. And so, I mean, there's all these things, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's, love your friends and also your enemies. I mean, there are all of these overlaps and these and alsos that he says to do. And if we begin to take those seriously, then our identity is rooted in the king and the kingdom. Then these other things that the culture is trying to define us as, are you in or are you out, become very dangerous and become alluring if we aren't rooted and saturated in the way of Jesus and what we read in the Gospels.
Man, that's beautiful. That's exactly right. You had multiple examples, but spirit and truth. I mean, that I think is just such an easy sort of image for people to grab because it's so familiar. We want to be people who are rooted in what is true about reality, Jesus as the center of what that is, and also people of the Spirit. And I just love that. And I'm curious now, because here's the thing. Books like this, they're awesome. And you're going to really, I think, affect a lot of people positively in ways that are going to really impact their spiritual journey. And I'm thinking of those people who maybe hear this interview or come to the book with a little bit more of a skepticism. And maybe that skepticism is rooted in, well, I was always told that Jesus, following Jesus is about getting the right answers, or I was always taught that the gospel is about finding clarity, not ambiguity or overlap or whatever metaphor we might use there. And I wonder, I'm assuming you've anticipated some of those reactions, and I'm curious what you think you would invite people to consider, that maybe this is a very new concept for them and they're wanting to be faithful to Jesus and all of that good stuff.
One of the things, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because yes, I've already been accused of all sorts of things. And then I said, well, the book just came out. So if you read it, let me know. We'll have some more questions and conversation. But it is amazing. Jesus, I want to be really clear on this, that this message of the book and the vision of the overlapped life, it's not some sort of spineless middle ground of compromise that's trying to just appease both sides. It actually takes more faith and more courage and more hope than even before. And one of the chapters that got cut out of the book, actually, which it was getting a little long, and so the editor made the right decision, but I really wish I could have kept it in there, but it was on faith and doubt. And because that is a mandorla in and of itself. And so we see things like doubting Thomas, who I believe gets a bad rap. And there are times where Jesus says, stop doubting, and believe. But then we read in Jude, in Jude 22, it talks about, it says, be patient with those who doubt. And one of my favorite parts of the story of the Great Commission is we often read Matthew 28, 18 through 20, right? All authority in heaven and on earth have been given to me. Go and make disciples. We don't read verse 17. So Jesus has his disciples, but right before the famous Great Commission passage, what does it say? It says, when the disciples saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. So we forget that his disciples, some of them still doubted, and yet Jesus still sent them out to make disciples, even in the midst of their doubt. And that's some mandorla space when it comes to faith. That if you're saying, well, I can't be a Christian, or I'm a Christian, but I'm not a very strong one, I have lots of doubts, I could never make disciples. Right there, verse 17, which I think we should include instead of just reading 18, 19, and 20 of chapter 28 of Matthew. I think we need to include 17 in there, because they worshiped him, but some doubted. There's some overlap there that have significant implications for us. And I write in the book that I think one of the most beautiful prayers is when one of the fathers that Jesus heals his child, he says, I believe, help me with my unbelief. He's praying a faith doubt mandorla prayer. And I think it's actually one of my most sacred prayers that I pray with great frequency as well. Lord, I believe, but help me with my unbelief, because there are times I struggle to believe this, but may your grace help me to believe what I can't believe on my own. How does all that work? I don't know. But that's the mystery of faith and why I need faith to believe in a God who can work even in the midst of my doubt.
Wow. That's beautiful. That's powerful. I think I've had those seasons. I mean, I have them regularly.
Yeah.
I don't know. I find the more that I read and research and process and have new questions, and doubt is this companion that I think a lot of Christians have in mind, that the more Christian you become, the less doubtful you become. And I haven't found that to be true in my own journey. And it's not as though I'm worried about losing my faith or anything like that, but it's learning that, man, the rubber band image is so true, that there's going to be these tensions that are real. And for me, I'd rather name them as real and step into that overlapping space with Jesus and see where Jesus takes me, rather than fear those spaces. So yeah, that's really,
actually
really helpful.
It reminds me, Kurt, the two Teresas, the two Saint Teresas that I love. There's obviously Saint Teresa of Calcutta. She struggled with doubt. I mean, after her death, they found her journals, and she struggled with doubt. She struggled with depression. She said, "I pray, but I don't even know if the Lord hears me. I have no joy when I pray." And so here's this woman that did such immense good that people just look to, like Mother Teresa, but yet she struggled so much in her faith. And then there's Saint Teresa of Avila, who years ago, this is my second favorite prayer. Yeah. She said, "Lord, I don't love you. Lord, I don't want to love you. But Lord, I want to love you. Amen." And that's a beautiful prayer, because it's saying, I'm not here, but I have enough faith that I want to be there. And so somehow, God, in the mystery of prayer, you've got to meet me, because I want to love you. And that faith and doubt overlap is there. And the Lord meets us in that mandorla space. That may be the most uncomfortable of all of the spaces that we might be in with Jesus, is the faith, doubt, mandorla overlap.
Wow. That's so well said. As we move towards a kind of a transition or a close to our conversation, which I'm loving. I'm looking at my clock. I'm like, wow, we're already 45 minutes into this thing. This is great. We could talk a long time. But one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we got into the conversation today was, and you've alluded to it earlier, but I want to talk more about faithful posture and the season we find ourselves in. I know experientially, people are in the kind of in-between that doesn't feel holy, the kind of in-between that feels violent, even emotionally. Jobs are being lost, questions about illness. I mean, all of the stuff that's been going on in our country and world. And then you add to that the rising appropriate visibility of, all of the racial injustice that is still perpetuated in our country after 400 years. And it's like, man, there is a lot of like, how do I stand faithful when I don't even know if I have enough energy to stand at all? And what does faithful posture look like during this season as you continue to discern, and maybe as you express
and this is going
to
just continue to grow before, during, and after the election for the next several years. But, division and politicking, it's like an Olympic sport in America these days. And it just seems that it's becoming more and more intense. Ken Burns said it well, the famous documentarian. He said, e pluribus unum, the motto of America, out of many one. He said, it seems we're quickly becoming a country with too much pluribus and very little unum. And I think that there's so much truth to that. And, I live here in the Philadelphia area, and Philadelphia has the reputation, sometimes quite well-deserved, of being people who are we're passionate people. But Philadelphians, they will tell you what's on their mind, whether you want to hear it or not. They're passionate, they're truthful. Some would say direct, others would say very rude. The city of brotherly shove, Negadelphia, right? There's all these nicknames for Philadelphia, right? And so they'll be very truthful.
Better than the Seattle Freeze. We've got that. So the Seattle Freeze, basically, we think you're horrible and won't talk to you. So it's kind of the extreme opposite. But
well, there's
anyway,
majoring in truth, but minoring in kindness and civility. Where in the Deep South, when I go visit the Deep South, they're so honoring and kind, but they're not always truthful. They lie very politely to you because they don't want to make it uncomfortable. And so this is really an important season for us because, Paul says, speaking the truth in love, he's talking about a double majoring in that overlap of being honest and honoring. We've got to be both. We're not trying to be Philadelphia, all truth, all honesty, but no honor. And we can't be the Deep South where it's all honor and very little honesty. We've got to be double majoring in honesty and honor. And see, the problem is that one of the real problems, as Martin Marty said, is that in our modern life, it's that people who are good at being civil lack really strong convictions. And unfortunately, people that have strong convictions often lack civility. And so, one of the things that's so important in this season is to make sure that we are engaged in those things. 1 Peter talks about, always be prepared to be able to give a reason for the hope that you have. And we go, yeah. But we forget that last little line, and do this with gentleness and respect. And that's a Mandola statement that even First Peter's talking about there, that we've got to be willing to do both. And that's hard, and it's going to become increasingly harder for us. But I think the best posture for us, and I talk about this in one of the chapters of the book, I think the book of Daniel will continue to become the book for the church in North America more and more in the years to come. Because we're going to find ourselves in a land that no longer is familiar and is no longer ours, and we're already playing an away game, but we will always be playing an away game that will continue to feel more and more hostile. And so I look at someone like Daniel and his friends, and I say, there's someone who was incredibly good at their jobs, well respected the government, even though this is the government that's oppressing the Jewish people. And there were times he said, nope, enough's enough. I can't do this. This is where I draw the line, but I'm going to do it with respect. And so I think that Mandola posture actually comes out beautifully in the book of Daniel. So I just encourage Christians in this season to read the book of Daniel and to notice Daniel's posture, not just his words and his friends as well, but his posture in this. Because it's convicted civility. There's conviction there, but there's incredible civility and respect even in the conviction that's being held. And so I really believe Daniel will be the book for churches in North America moving forward. Wow.
Well, on that, man, that's if you're a preacher, there's your next sermon series, right? I mean, let's step into Daniel. No, thank you so much, JR. I mean, so much wisdom in this conversation today. And I trust that folks will go ahead and grab the book, The Sacred Overlap, Learning to live faithfully in the space between. And as we get ready to part ways here for now, I'm wondering, where can people track you down? I don't know your address because that's weird, right? But, as far as I'm going to go find that guy and let him know some things. But as far as your work, obviously they can Google you, but do you have some resources or some work you'd like to just point folks towards to follow along with your journey? The easiest thing to do, our website is kairospartnerships.org. It's KAIROS, kairospartnerships.org. But I'm on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. But my email address is actually in the back of the book on the last page, because I really encourage readers, if you want to interact with me, I'd love to hear from readers. So if you want to get a hold of me, my email is right there in the back of the book on the last page. That's awesome. Yeah, I'm actually trying to track it down. I'm like, where's that? That's cool. That's a great idea. Sorry, that's why there's a little gap there. That sounds great. And I encourage anyone who's listening today to go check it out. And JR, thanks so much for being with us. I really just enjoyed this conversation and really wish you just a lot of blessing and guidance from the Lord as you continue to talk about this book and all. Thanks so much for having me on, Kurt. Always great to be with you.
Thanks for listening to Theology Curator. For more resources from Kurt Willems, check out theologycurator.com/newsletter to sign up for our email update list. For new listeners of the podcast, we hope you will subscribe via iTunes, Google, or your podcast manager of choice. If you like what you hear, please leave the show a review. For regular listeners, consider supporting Kurt's online ministry at patreon.com/Kurt Willems. Lastly, please don't let this conversation end when the episode is over. We hope you feel empowered in regular life to explore theology and faith in intelligent and humanizing ways.